Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. Hey, Patricia.
Hey, Greg.
Well, back in April, you wrote a column with a headline that was really hard to miss. The Socialists are coming. Well, the elections have happened, at least the nomination rounds, and the answer from voters was not exactly a pro-socialist landslide. Democratic Socialists in Georgia won one major state house race, came close in another to get attention, and lost badly in some other high-profile contests. So today we're going to talk about what this movement really is, why younger voters are tuning in, and what it means for Georgia Democrats and for Georgia Republicans heading into the rest of 2026. Patricia, this stems from a column you wrote months ago before the May primary, where you kind of spotlighted a few of the major primary challenges that some incumbent Democrats were facing, as well as some of the open seat races.
Yes, the headline was "The Socialists are coming." The rest of the story is the Socialists came, and they did okay. They did not have a massive takeover. They did pick up one House seat, as you mentioned. Mathewos Sampson will succeed Park Cannon in her district, but it was not a socialist wave. But if you look at kind of their percentages, incremental gains. Now they'll have two members of the General Assembly instead of one, who was Gabriel Sanchez. He was the first one. Now we'll have Mathewos Sampson as well. Also, Democratic Socialists had a significant increase in candidates who were making significant runs against sitting Democrats. And I think that this will be a year that we look back on as the beginning of something pretty significant for the DSA.
Yeah, I mean, or maybe we look back at Gabriel Sanchez's victory a couple of years ago as the beginning, right? Because that was a huge upset. He beat Terry Nolowitz in a race that, we were kind of monitoring, but it was not seen as a winnable seat, I should say. And he surprised many, including Terry Nolowitz, by defeating her in that primary. I also thought that he would immediately kind of be sidelined, not just by Republicans, but by fellow Democrats. But instead, Gabriel Sanchez has been an important part of the caucus.
He's been an important part of the caucus. I think his demeanor in the caucus, his demeanor in the Capitol played a big part in the success that Gabe Sanchez had. I think people thought that when a Democratic Socialist came into the Georgia General Assembly, he would be knocking over tables and introducing bills that had no chance. He would be, I think people assumed he would be a disruptor, literally. What he ended up being was a pretty valuable member of the caucus, a young voice for people who I think are looking to hear from anyone supporting workers, anybody supporting free or low-cost housing, healthcare, anyone talking about younger voters. That was Gabe Sanchez, and I think that the Democratic caucus found that valuable. He was also, I think, collaborative, not just with Democrats, but also with Republicans. There were some cases where he and the Freedom Caucus were the only ones voting against bills, particularly when it came to any kind of corporate subsidies or tax breaks. So I think Sanchez had a really good first term. I did not know if Gabriel Sanchez would be a one-off for Democratic Socialists. He happened to catch Terry Nolowitz and her supporters, I think, kind of unaware. And my question was, well, what happens with this? Was that just a moment, or does it become a movement inside the Democratic Party? I think the results here in Georgia, the number of candidates from the DSA running, and then the results across the country show that this is probably a moment for Democratic Socialists and a movement, not just a one-off here in the state. Yeah,
not just a blip. And it's interesting, too, to think about, where the socialists, what the policy issues that Democratic Socialists are embracing, because many of them are also just tried and true Democratic policies that we've heard from more liberal members of the Democratic Party for years, right? Higher minimum wages, more affordable housing, efforts to tackle student debt, efforts to expand Medicaid, efforts to bring down the cost of living. I mean, I think there's definitely a dovetailing between the Democratic Socialist platform and the modern Democratic Party of Georgia's overall kind of views and ideology. There's certainly some differences too, though.
Yeah, there are definitely differences. And I think that was the message that we heard from the sitting Democrats in the General Assembly who had DSA candidates running against them. Esther Panich had a pretty significant challenge from a DSA candidate named Aaron Baker in Sandy Springs. Stacey Evans in her Atlanta district also had a challenge from Jeremiah Olney. And both Panich and Evans said, this may be a Democratic primary, but these are not Democrats running against us. The DSA is not the Democratic Party. The DSA was very vocal in its opposition to Cop City, which we call the Public Safety Training Center. They have a significantly much more left orientation than the mainstream Democratic Party. Jeremiah Olney called himself a leftist. If you go on the DSA website, there's a lot of information about Marxist literature, the Marxist movement. And I think that it's true that the DSA is specifically not the Democratic Party. That's why it exists. But the DSA candidates are saying we have to pick a party, we have to pick a place to start to make our changes. And that's why they're running in the Democratic primary. Some other DSA candidates say, well, I consider myself both a Democrat and a member of the DSA. You can do both at the same time. But the sitting members of the Democratic Party were like, absolutely not. I'm a loyal member of the Democratic caucus, and somebody from the DSA would come in to change that.
Yeah, and Patricia, that's why we were watching these races so closely, because when Terry Nolowitz was defeated by Gabriel Sanchez, that was a Smyrna-based district. It was part of the bluification of Cobb County. Two of the higher profile races in this May primary, what you mentioned, were Esther Panich, that Sandy Springs, very sort of establishment-friendly part district. She was running against Aaron Baker, who went to Woodland Elementary, which is the same elementary school I went to when I was growing up in the Sandy Springs area. But again, a very sort of more establishment-friendly Democratic crowd. It used to be a Republican-leaning district for years before it flipped in the beginning of the Donald Trump era. And then you've got Stacey Evans, who, of course, was a candidate for governor in 2018. She has a very in-town district too. So very kind of different districts, but the same outcomes in both, with the incumbents, well-known incumbents, fending off the Democratic Socialist challengers. You also had, you mentioned Mathewos Sampson running to replace Park Cannon. That was a far more sort of traditionally deep left district.
Yeah, and Park Cannon herself is extremely progressive. So to me, if there was one district that I had to pick where a DSA member might be successful, it was certainly in that district. The DSA got behind Sampson as well in a way that they did not get behind Olney and Aaron Baker. And so I think Sampson had a lot more resources and volunteer hours down there helping him get into that seat as well. But I think when you look at what Democrats, I think, should be thinking about in terms of the success of the DSA members, not just the races they were able to win, but just the noise they've been able to make, the attention that they've gotten. There's now a DSA member on the Atlanta City Council, Kelsea Bond, who is extremely vocal, incredibly good at social media, very good to camera, very skilled with communication. There is a real critique inside the Democratic Party, especially from younger voters, that the party structure, that the longtime members are too focused on corporate interests, are too focused on making businesses happy, and that they've kind of lost their way when it comes to taking care of average Georgians, particularly young people who kind of come out of college, find themselves saddled with a ton of debt, not a great job market, AI sort of changing the reality of what it looks like to have a job in America. And I think they're kind of the American contract feels like it's fraying for younger voters, and that's why they're looking for something that hasn't been a part of creating it, and that's the opportunity that I think the DSA is exploiting right now.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Kelsea Bond, because we at the state capitol focus a lot about Gabriel Sanchez and these other races, but Kelsea Bond joins Gabriel Sanchez as the other kind of highest profile member of the DSA in elected office in the Atlanta area. And yeah, as you mentioned, she's a member of the Atlanta City Council and already making an impact. I was talking to our colleague, City Hall reporter Shadi Bousaid, who was telling me how she's already, injecting a different view into debates that the City Council is having, already changing some of the dynamics under the Dickens administration, already kind of being a new voice to hold power to account at City Hall. So, and I did an event with her for Leadership Atlanta, interesting watching it, which Leadership Atlanta brings together a lot of the young leaders of Atlanta. And there's often sort of corporate sponsors too. And she was basically bringing a very anti-corporate message to that group. And you could see it resonated with some of the members of that audience. But she's going to have quite the impact, especially with the organizational side of things, as she and her allies try to bring more DSA members to local boards, because that's where you could also see a huge impact. The state legislature, we've got hundreds of members, more limited impact, especially for Democrats. But you start seeing local city councils, local county commissions electing DSA members, and that's where you could really see change from the grassroots.
Yeah, the mayor's race in Athens came down to a Democrat and a member of the Democratic Socialists, who is Tim Denson. Denson's been around Athens for a long time, so it's hard to think of him as sort of like an upstart member of the DSA, but he certainly is very, very progressive. They talk a lot about the same issues as Democrats, housing affordability, but come at it from a different perspective. I think also come at it maybe more even aggressively. Now, Democrats themselves will say this is a huge distraction for the General Assembly, that they believe they're on the verge of starting to have a chance maybe someday of taking over the General Assembly, of winning enough seats to have the House majority, and to have to fend off a challenge from the left in your own primary before going on, in some cases, to a competitive general election. They feel like that will both drag the party left in a state that is not looking for that, and also drain resources and time from what should be the Democratic effort to defeat Republicans in the General Assembly. It reminds me so much of the Tea Party movement that you and I both covered, that Republicans then were saying, listen, you guys are going to drag this party so far to the right that we're not going to be able to win major elections. That hasn't turned out that way, but it has taken the party significantly to the right. And I think Democrats will find themselves with that very familiar challenge and dilemma of having the threat of a primary from your flank and then having to go refight to take the middle back again. So a lot of churn and disruption inside the party this cycle, and I don't think it's the end of that.
Let's pick up on that thread after a quick break. When we come back, why Georgia's socialist candidates are part of a much bigger national story, and why Republicans are eager to make them the face of the Democratic Party in 2026. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. If you've got a question you'd like to ask us here on Politically Georgia, we'd love to answer it, but we can't hear it until you call our Politically Georgia call-in hotline. You can call that anytime, leave your question, we'll play it back and answer it right here on the show. The number is 770-810-5297, and I'll let you in on a secret. You can also text that number, 770-810-5297. You can also email us at politicallygeorgia, all one word, at ajc.com. Shaney B and his legion of interns cannot wait to hear from you. Okay, so Patricia, this story about socialists, the socialist movement, the Democratic Socialist movement, is happening inside a much bigger national conversation. Democratic Socialists are gaining steam in other parts of the country. In New York, we saw Mamdani, after he won the New York mayor's race, also backed a number of his allies in congressional primaries. And to the surprise of many, they upset incumbents. They won open seats. Also in Colorado, just the other day, you saw Democratic Socialists and basically more liberal upstarts beat entrenched Democratic incumbents in primaries that I think even some locals weren't expecting the margin of those victories. That has not happened here in Georgia yet. And I think it's worth examining why, because Georgia Democrats, the coalitions here are built differently than Democrats in New York or Seattle or Denver, primarily because the coalition here depends mostly on Black voters who at least tend to be, by and large, slightly more conservative in general than their counterparts in more white areas or in Denver or Washington State. Also, of course, that coalition in statewide elections depends more on suburban swing voters who tend to be more moderate.
Yes, and if you go to a DSA meeting or see a group of organizers, it is mostly white. Now, Mathewos Sampson is a Black DSA member, but I would say the overwhelming majority are white liberals, and that is a coalition that Democrats in Georgia already have. So I think they are looking for a way to expand their numbers and to more moderate, independent voters, because that's how you get to a majority. I want to read a little bit from the DSA website so you get a sense of the fact it's not just a messaging difference among DSA members and Democrats. There are kind of specific, very significant policy differences. And this is why sitting Democrats say this is not the same thing as, you're not getting just a younger Democrat. You're getting a really different point of view when it comes to electing DSA members. The Democratic Socialists of America, this is from their website, seek to facilitate a transition to a truly democrat and socialist society in which the means of production are democratically and socially controlled. DSA rejects an economic order based on private profit, alienated labor, gross inequities of wealth, and power, discrimination based on race, sex, sexual orientation, gender expression, disability status, age, religion, etc., and brutality and violence in defense of the status quo. Envisions a humane social order based on popular control of resources and production. So that's a different proposal than your typical Georgia Democrat. And that's what people are signing up for, electing a DSA member. I don't know that that's entirely evident when voters are going to the polls in a Democratic primary, seeing two names on a Democratic ballot and thinking, well, maybe somebody younger, a little bit more progressive would be a nice change of pace for the Democratic Party. But DSA members are significantly more to the left than just that.
I think that's very fair. And it's also fair to say, too, that just because it's a younger, more progressive Democrat running, they don't necessarily line up with the Democratic Socialist
that's
movement, too, right? So, because we've seen a lot of those sort of challenges, especially in Georgia against the now late Representative David Scott, but he was running for another term. And we had many, many Democrats sort of lining up saying, hey, we need a more generational challenge, a more confrontational approach, someone who will show up at more local meetings and all that. But none of the leading contenders, at least, were aligning themselves with the DSA movement. So we haven't seen that in Georgia, but we're certainly seeing that in other parts of the country. You know, one of the arguments we're seeing, or many establishment Democrats around the country in these primaries, they're campaigning on the "I fought Donald Trump," which used to be enough. Whereas a lot of primary voters, especially those tilting more and more to the left, are saying, "Okay, but what are you going to do about my rent? What are you going to do about lower wages? What are you going to do about affordability issues?" So the same affordability issues that we're seeing come up so much in the general election context, of course, are coming up in these nominating contests as well.
Yeah, I also think that there are some societal things going on around the country, economic dynamics going on around the country that is opening the door to voters looking for another option on the ballot. In New York City, especially, the wealth disparity in New York City is absolutely immense. There are multi-billionaires living alongside people really, really struggling to make ends meet, people living well outside of Manhattan because they certainly can never afford to live in Manhattan. I think even the White House is a great example of the wealth disparity in the country. President Trump just made $2.2 billion in a single year. And many people in the rest of the country are saying, what in the world? Younger progressive voters are saying something needs to change, and something needs to change drastically. Who is going to put that in front of me so I can vote on it on a ballot? And I think members of the DSA are delivering a different option for younger voters in particular. And I think there are just so many dynamics playing into this, making a DSA proposal seem more attractive to voters when sitting Democrats have been promising a lot of the same things and not quite delivering it for years and years.
And we're also seeing some more mainstream Democrats kind of channel those arguments. I mean, the best example I can think of course, is Senator John Ossoff, who's running on an anti-corruption theme. He has definitely taken up some populist messaging over the years. I mean, long before he even ran for Senate, when he ran for Congress in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. And as well as he, when he launched his Senate campaign back in 2019 and 2020, he took on some populist themes that sort of played that frustration that many voters from both parties have over the elite getting richer and regular folks struggling even more in this economy, this K-shaped economy we hear so much about. Patricia, let's also talk about how Republicans are responding, because they would love to make Democratic Socialists the face of the Democratic Party, right? They'd love to kind of paint the farthest of the far left. They'd love to air ads reading the sort of manifesto of the DSA and say, this is where the Democratic Party of Georgia wants to take you.
Yeah, there was a moment in the debate between Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock in 2020 when Loeffler kept calling Warnock a radical socialist or a radical Democrat so many times that it became a meme. She said he is a radical socialist. Don't trust him. Just over and over again, radical socialist. And we said at the time, Raphael Warnock's not a socialist. Democrats are not socialists. It was almost a fact check to say, listen, this is hyperbole. Now, in reality, you fast forward just a few years, and some people on the Democratic ticket are socialists. So it is exactly what Republicans were trying to message. And at the time, even just a few years ago, it felt like it was a bridge too far to call the Democrats socialists. Now, in fact, it is quite literally true when you get into some of these individual races. And I think Democrats are also trying to wrestle with that reality. And what does it look like if you're trying to tell Republicans we're not socialists, but some of your own voters are picking socialists on the ballot over sitting Democrats? It's a real challenge, I think, for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I think I remember counting how many times Kelly Loeffler said that at the debate, radical liberal, 13 times. I had to fact check it just now, but it was 13 times doing that 2020 debate right before the runoff. Yeah, Patricia, you wrote, as much as the leftward moves are giving establishment Democrats heartburn, they're making Republicans in Georgia downright giddy. So we'll see how Republicans sort of deploy that argument. It is we've written about the sort of all Democrats are socialist arguments from the GOP for years. That was David Perdue's kind of main case, even when he ran for his first term against Michelle Nunn in 2014. And certainly when he ran against Ossoff in 2020, he was painting all Democrats as socialists. So now that a very small handful of elected officials are, we'll see how that changes the dynamic. Do you think it will play a major role in this? We haven't necessarily heard Mike Collins or Rick Jackson use that argument too much. They're using other arguments for now.
I don't know that it's going to play a role in Georgia's statewide elections, mostly because the Democrats who are running John Ossoff and Keisha Lance Bottoms actually aren't socialists. They are not talking about socializing the means of production and socializing profits in Georgia. That's just never anything they've ever said or, quite frankly, contemplated. However, I do think that certainly Republicans statewide will be calling Democrats socialists, even radical socialists. And in some cases, that will be quite literally true.
Yeah. Well, I think we can put a wrap on it there. But this will be interesting, too, to see also how the few elected Democratic socialists in Georgia office also react to the November campaign. Do they go out and rally folks for Keisha Lance Bottoms and John Ossoff, or do they kind of stay on the sidelines? We'll see. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. If you're not yet a subscriber to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, we would love for you to become one. AJC subscriptions are what make our reporting on Politically Georgia possible. You can become a subscriber today if you just go to this one simple website, ajc.com/start. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia. And we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.